Amen. Thank you, Chris. You guys can have a seat. Good morning, Illuminate. Oh, my goodness. It's got to be summertime or something. We got to do that again. You ready? Just want to let you know it's coming. Are you ready? Good morning, Illuminate. Good morning. There you go. All right. Hey, if you got your Bibles, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. If you walked in, you can if you grab the notes, the text is also there. I want to thank Steve Johnson for filling in for me last week. We're going to pick up right where he left off. If you're new to the church, if it's your first time here, for the last couple months, we've been working our way through this book written by the Apostle Paul to a struggling church, a young church that existed in the first century AD. And I want you to know that the text this morning, originally, I had divided into two sermons. But as I read it over and over and over, I realized that there is really one grand theme throughout the entire chapter. So that's what I want to bring to you. And I want to share that theme with you at the very beginning. And the theme is this. The big idea is this. When you come to Christ, when you place your faith in Jesus Christ, not everything about you has to change. Let me say it again because I want it to sink in a little bit. When you come to faith in Jesus Christ, not everything about you has to change. And you say, well, time out. I haven't heard that before. Doesn't Jesus change everything? Yes, Jesus changes everything internally, but not necessarily externally. Let me explain. One of the challenges for these Corinthian believers is that as many of them came to faith in Christ, they thought they had to make these radical lifestyle changes. They thought they had to change their marital status. Should we be married or should we be single? How about this one? Should Christians have sex or not? We'll put that in its proper context in a second. Should we change our ethnicity? Now, we know that at this point in the letter, the Apostle Paul is responding to specific questions that the church is asking. We don't have those questions. We don't have the letter that they've written to him with those questions. But it's kind of like listening to a phone conversation where you hear someone speaking to someone else on the other end of the line and you're just not sure who that person is, or you're not exactly sure what questions they're asking, but you can hear the person's response to the questions. And so that's what we do have. So we actually do know quite a bit. And I want to forewarn you, the questions that they're asking are going to seem kind of strange to you and me. And the reason why they sound strange is because we have to put them in their cultural context. And here's the first thing we have to understand. These early believers living in the city of Corinth, having heard the message of Jesus Christ, embracing the gospel, they are completely unchurched. There's no shared moral compass. The church in the city of Corinth is very different than the church in the city of Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Jews were coming to Christ. They were accepting Jesus as the Messiah. And so they had a shared sense of morality. They had a guidebook. It was their Old Testament. The Christians in Corinth, their guide was the culture. And as we know, the city of Corinth was exceedingly wicked and corrupt. In fact, Steve mentioned it last week. There was a word coined to describe one who lived a lustful lifestyle, Korinthazai, one who acts like a Corinthian. And so they've got a lot of questions. They've got a lot of questions. Now that we're Christians, what does that mean for our external circumstances? Marriage. Should Christians be married? What if a Christian what if I'm married and I receive Jesus as the Messiah, but my spouse doesn't? Should I stay married to that person? What about my ethnicity? Does my ethnicity need to be changed? I was born a Jew, but then I met Jesus. Does that mean I have to become a non-Jew? And so they're asking these questions in the light of their cultural context, and even the questions regarding marriage may seem odd to you, but let me again give you some historical background. In the first century AD, it's estimated that 1/3 of the people living in Rome were slaves, and slaves did not marry. Because if you were one slave and you were interested in marrying another slave, here's the challenge for you. The slave owner could sell your spouse, and they'd be gone. So for slaves, marriage didn't even exist. Amongst the common people, marriage looked like this. A man would approach a father with a few goats and say, I want to marry your daughter. And the father might say something like this, throw in a couple of oxen and we'll call it a deal. And that's how most marriages took place. What you and I are most familiar with in terms of marriage ceremonies was only for the upper class. They exchanged vows, they exchanged rings, they prayed, asking their Greek gods to give them blessings in life. There were flowers, they ate cake. I hate to tell you this, but most of what took place in your marriage ceremony is straight up out of pagan background. And so these Christians are like, what's right and what's wrong? Now that we've accepted Christ, we come out of this culture that is so oversaturated in every way with a lustful lifestyle. We've got questions. We've got guys who have 2, 3, 4 different wives. Is that okay? There's no shame in visiting prostitutes. Is that okay? It was just all part of the lifestyle. And so they're asking these questions, and Paul responds. Here's the first question. Are physical relationships between a man and a woman wrong in some way? And if they're not wrong, then what is the proper context for those physical relationships? Verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, there you go. That's how we know that they wrote with these questions. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So the Corinthians are thinking, all right, we live in a sex-saturated society. Remember, the cult of Dionysus was in the city of Corinth. It was essentially a sex cult, where temple prostitutes would apply their trade in the streets of the city. And it was a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Not only was it acceptable, it was a form of worship. So we know that Christians are called to be pure, and we live in this sex-saturated society, so maybe Christians should just be celibate. Maybe we should just distance ourselves from physical contact like that, and maybe we should all just be single. Paul responds, and he says, no, we shouldn't all be single. Celibacy is a good thing. Singleness is a good thing. But there's something else that needs to be considered. Verse 2. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. So again, Paul's going to say in a second, celibacy is good for some, but those who have sexual desires, they should get married. So here's what the text is saying. According to the Bible, marriage is between a man and a woman, and that is the proper context for a sexual relationship. I want to press the pause button right now, because some, perhaps in the room, are thinking, certainly some online who are listening will be thinking, I knew it. This is the problem, right? The Bible is outdated, it's antiquated, it's totally out of touch with modern times. I mean, look, if someone has a sexual urge, why not just go find somebody and fulfill that sexual urge? What could possibly be wrong with that? Listen carefully. God created sex. It's actually his idea. And what he wants for you is to experience the greatest amount of sexual satisfaction. That's why the Bible says the proper context for a sexual relationship is between a man and a woman who are married. University of Chicago sociologist Edward Lauman conducted research seeking to understand what made a satisfying sex life. It's a really interesting study. So it was discovered that the most sexually satisfied people on the planet are married. Who knew? Race, socioeconomics, not so much a factor. Physical attractiveness, not so much a factor. It turns out that ugly people enjoy having sex too. Who would have thought? Married people, that is, people living in monogamous, committed relationships, have the most sexually satisfied sex lives, right? So now let me be clear. Paul isn't saying that sex is the only reason for marriage. Remember, here he is addressing the specific issue in light of the cultural context. Here's what Paul is doing. He's putting healthy restrictions on what would have been accepted at the time. Like I said, it was acceptable for a man to visit a prostitute. It was acceptable for a man to have more than one wife. You could have a wife who cooked for you. You could take another wife who cleaned. You could take another wife just to bear children for you. You could have another wife just to be sexually intimate with. And it was absolutely accepted. And so Paul lays down this restriction. So you have to understand, these are really revolutionary concepts in their time. One man, and we'll let him have his own husband, his own wife. And that is the expression of sex within, proper expression of sex within that relationship. So to take it one step further, Paul's about to say, there's actually a mutual responsibility that married couples have to each other. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise, the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And certainly in this patriarchal society, in this time, the husbands are going, yes, okay, that's right, that's how it is, okay, we understand that, agreed. But then Paul says this, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Unheard of. Unheard of. For Paul to say, hey, husbands, you don't have authority over your own body. Your wife does. This is a revolutionary concept. This just wasn't said. This is totally new territory. And what is Paul doing? He's leveling the playing field. This is a mutual giving of one to another. And by the way, he's describing it as a concrete obligation. Also, that phrase, conjugal rights, implies much more than just physical contact. It actually implies romance. It implies cherishing your spouse, nourishing your spouse, providing the warmth and the emotional support that your spouse needs. All of that is inherent in this idea of conjugal rights. So, verse 5, stop, it's literally a command, stop depriving one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So what's Paul's major concern here in this moment? It is to guard against temptation. So a healthy sexual relationship between a husband and a wife is actually a deterrent to affairs. Now there may be specific reasons for abstain for a while. Maybe you abstain from sex along with, because of some issue that is occurring in your life, in your wife's life, in your family's life, and there's prayer, and there's fasting, and Paul says, don't make it too long. Just a short time, so that you would come together again. Now here's the reality. In many marriages, one spouse will withhold sex from another spouse and use it as a bargaining tool. They will use it as a source of leverage. It will be a power play. And what Paul is saying to Christian couples is this: it should be seen as a way to love and serve your spouse as only you can rightfully do. Now, verse 6, as a concession, not a command, Paul says this: I wish that all were as I myself am. What's he referring to? Well, at this point in his life, he's single. He says, I wish all Christians were single. Why? We'll get to that in a second. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. I wish everyone was like me. And by the way, he says this as a concession. He says it's not a command. This is saying it's my opinion, it's my preference. And we do know at this point, right, Paul was single, but It's also pretty obvious that at one point Paul was married because he was a member of this religious ruling elite class. They were married men, part of the Sanhedrin. So at one time he was married. Perhaps by now his wife has died. And he says, I wish everyone was single like me. So let's pause the button now and talk about singleness. Singleness is not a curse. Singleness is not a detriment. Paul says singleness is actually a gift, and he'll explain why. It is unfettered devotional time with God. Imagine Paul saying something like this. I call up my married buddies and I ask them, hey, you want to go evangelize after work today? And they say, would love to, but I can't because you see, I got to pick up the kids after school. Well, what about later on tonight? Well, I can't because I'll be tucking the kids into bed and I'm going to spend some time with my wife. Now, this is why Paul says, this isn't a command. But he says, I wish that everybody was as free as I am to serve Jesus without any restrictions, a wife or a family. Now, if all Christians were like Paul, that's why he says this isn't a command, then we wouldn't be procreating little Christian disciples, right? And that would be a problem too. And in Genesis, part of the reason why God creates man and woman is so that they can come together and make babies and have families. That's discipleship as well. But Paul says, I wish everybody was like me. So in this sense, singleness is a gift. Celibacy is a gift. So he says this to the singles and the widows, verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, then they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Called to singleness? Great. If you want to be married? Great. Another question, Paul. What about divorce? So this is really interesting because in ancient Rome, you didn't have to file any papers to get a divorce. All you had to do was to declare yourself divorced, unmarried. Now, if there was some dowry involved at some point, then the polite thing to do would be to return the dowry to the father, but you didn't have to do that either. You could simply declare yourself divorced. And so in Paul's day, marriage was an absolute disaster and a joke. Divorce was everywhere for any reason at all. So the Corinthians want to know, what is the Christian belief and practice regarding divorce? Verse 10, to the married, note that he's speaking to those Christians who are married, I give this charge. And then he says, not I, but the Lord. In other words, he says, Jesus actually spoke to this. The wife should not separate from her husband. So the word separate and the word divorce were actually synonymous in Paul's time. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. So the Christian view of marriage is permanence. And if one spouse leaves, that spouse can't in that moment consider himself or herself unmarried. Reconciliation should be pursued. Why? You got to go back to God's original design. In Genesis chapter 2, God creates Adam. Actually, God creates all the animals. He creates all this, he creates all life other than animals and Eve. And then suddenly he realizes, wait a minute, there's something not good here in creation. Adam is alone. It's the first not good of creation. He's like, oh, we have an issue here. Adam is lonely, which is really interesting because he had this relationship with God, but there is still something missing in Adam. And so God says he needs someone just like him. So he parades all of the animals in front of Adam, and Adam names them. And Adam's like, okay, cow, horse, dog. But none of them are like me. And so God causes a sleep to fall upon Adam, takes from his side, from his rib, the flesh, opens it up, and from that makes woman. And he presents the woman to Adam. And it's really pretty beautiful, actually. In Hebrew, you know what Adam does when he sees Eve? He breaks out into poetry because he's so amazed and he's so delighted. And he says, finally, at last, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. She's going to be called Eve. Then the text says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and you can thank me for that later, and cling to his wife. And the two become what? One flesh. You know, there's very few things in the Bible where God explicitly says, I hate this. And one of them is divorce. And I know this is a tender subject. And I want to say that I get it. But let's ask the question, why does God say, I hate divorce? It goes back to his original design. The two become one flesh. And divorce is that tearing apart of one flesh. And that causes an incredible amount of pain. And so what happens is the D word gets into our language as married couples. And it's like we just kind of throw it out there. We just kind of lob it out there. But once it's out there, it's out there. And there's a lot of collateral damage that begins when the conversations involve the D word, especially if kids are involved. Here's the reality. All marriages, my own marriage, it's headed for disaster unless Jesus is involved. You know, that's what makes marriage work. It's really a marriage of three when Jesus is involved. I'll be honest with you, there are times I wake up and I'm like, I don't feel like loving anybody. But it's my commitment to Jesus Christ that compels me to be obedient and to love those around me, even when I don't feel like loving them. And you know, a funny thing happens in life. We start to take each other for granted, our spouses. That's why it's really important. You wake up in the morning and just a quick prayer, thank God for my spouse. Because you'll find that a heart that's filled with gratitude drives complacency, even bitterness, out of your relationship. So whenever I'm officiating a wedding, I say, there's a word that you have to remove from your vocabulary. And this is why. So Paul's laying it down. He says, you know, this is the Christian view of marriage, and it is permanence. And if one leaves, then reconciliation should be sought. So he's standing up, right? In spite of the permissiveness of Greek and Roman, and I will add American culture, Christian marriage is about a covenant commitment you make to your spouse before the God who created you both. So the next question, Paul, what if my spouse is not a Christian? Right? When we were married as pagans. We had a pagan ceremony, but then I met Jesus. My spouse didn't. Should I stay married? The answer is yes. You should stay married. You shouldn't leave him or her. Verse 12, to the rest I say, not the Lord. In other words, Jesus didn't speak directly to this issue, but Paul's trustworthy in this, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Again, Paul is throwing down some intense countercultural commands. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. What in the world does that mean? We're going to explain that in a second. Verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So if you are married to an unbeliever and they consent to stay with you, stay married. In fact, an unbelieving spouse will experience the overflow of God's blessing in your life. As you live your life as a Christian, married to one who is not a Christian, and as you walk before God in obedience, you experience God's pleasure, you experience God's blessing on your life. That spills over onto your unbelieving spouse and also your children. That's what Paul means when he says the husband will be made holy, the wife will be made holy, the kids will be made holy. However, if the unbelieving spouse chooses to leave, then the Christian is not bound. And if you think, but I gotta stay married. I gotta stay married because I am my spouse's only hope of becoming a Christian. Here's what Paul would say. Marriage is not an evangelistic tool, it's an evangelistic context. Let me say it again. Marriage is not an evangelistic tool, it's an evangelistic context. Paul says, how do you know? How do you know that they will get saved? Just because you are married to a non-Christian, that doesn't mean that non-Christian will become saved. So let me just throw this out there because it's appropriate. Missionary dating, you know what I mean by that? Probably not a good idea. So here's what happens oftentimes, especially as a Christian gets older in his or her singleness. They find somebody that they like, they're attracted to, the person is really sweet, maybe they're very kind, but they don't know Jesus Christ. And the Christian will think, I bet if we start dating, they'll become a Christian. And God will use me to help them become a Christian. And that becomes a justification for entering into that relationship. What Paul is saying is you got to think twice about that. How do you know? And let me just tell you from pastoral experience, on more than one account, I've counseled men or women, Christian men or women, who have told me, when I was walking down the aisle, I kind of had this sense that this might not be the best idea. But I just hoped and believed the best. And now it's kind of a train wreck. Because here's what you need to know about marriage. If you're in the room and you're single, the beautiful thing about being married to a believer in Jesus Christ is that you look into that person's heart and you see what is the most important thing in his or her life. And that is their commitment, their relationship to Jesus Christ. And you look into their heart and you go, I so get that. I totally understand that. And that there's a connection, that spiritual connection, that breeds an emotional connection, that leads to a physical connection. But if you're looking into someone's heart, they're looking into your heart, and as they look into your heart, they stare into the most important thing in your life, your relationship with Jesus, and they say, I don't totally get it. But I love you. But the thing that's most important to you, I don't completely understand. That's why Paul says, how do you know? That connection will be impaired. And then what happens is when we give ourselves physically to another outside of, now I'm really getting old-fashioned, when we give to each other physically outside of the context of the commitment of a marriage relationship, here's what happens. It's a smokescreen. When you make that physical connection, things become a little tainted because you kind of bonded yourself with that person in a very intimate way. And then it clouds your ability to see that person at times for who they really are. So, God cares. All that to say, God cares. God actually cares. And by the way, if you want to understand how something should be used to its full potential, go talk to its creator. Go talk to its creator. God created it, designed it, and helps us understand how it's to be used best. So, should salvation change your marital status? No. Christianity wasn't meant to tear up families. Do you have to give up sex? No. Have to give up marriage? No. Live as you are called, verse 17. Now it gets really interesting. for a word you haven't heard in a while. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all of the churches, not just for you Corinthians, but everywhere, the church in Jerusalem, everywhere. So was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision. But here's what counts. Keeping the commandment of God. Okay, so you're like, wow, that's more circumcision talk than I've ever had or wanted to have. Let me explain. Circumcision was the mark. It was the identifying characteristic for the Jewish man. It placed him into covenant relationship as one of God's chosen people. Not to sound weird, but some ancient rabbis believed that the great Jewish patriarch, the guy that started it all, Abraham, is standing in front of the gates of heaven. And he has one job. And his job is to inspect every Jewish male. Kind of a weird job description. His job is to inspect every Jewish male to make sure that he is circumcised, because if he's not circumcised, he's not getting into heaven. Now, what are we talking about? Ethnicity. Ooh, nothing runs deeper than ethnicity. Paul says, doesn't matter. If you came to Christ as a circumcised Jew, you don't have to do any reversal surgery. Because it's not about that. What's it about? It's about keeping the commandments of God. So verse 20, here's the overarching statement of the whole conversation. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Don't be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. Bondservants were more like indentured servants, and they had the opportunity to buy their freedom. Hey, if you have the opportunity to do that, great. But you can be a Christian and still be a bondservant. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is actually a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You're still serving Christ. Even if you're free, you're still a servant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. And again, the point, so brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Altering your external circumstances does not put a smile on God's face. That's not the way. So, what does this mean for you and I? These verses really challenge our contemporary individualism. Our culture tells us, don't ever rest with your current status in life. Upwardly mobile. More money, more power, greater influence, more control over others and your own life. Paul says, the key to being happy is not there. The key to being happy and rewarded is living the Christian life inwardly and not focusing on what is external. So your identity is not in your job. Your identity is not in your ethnicity. It's not whether you're single or you're married. Your identity is in Jesus Christ. So, practically speaking, you're the CEO of the company. I've become a Christian. Does that mean I got to humble myself and become the janitor? No. Remain the CEO and be the CEO that Jesus wants you to be. Bloom where you're planted. Well, I'm the janitor. Shouldn't I aspire for something more now that I'm a Christian? Well, I'm just the janitor. If you're the janitor of the company, great, fine. Be the janitor that Jesus wants you to be. Because here's what you need to realize. The Christian CEO and the Christian janitor are both sinners in need of a Savior. And actually, they're both next to each other on bended knee at the foot of the cross because they need Jesus. So it's not about that. It's about being obedient. And every single week it's just too easy. It always comes back to Jesus. Paul says, you are already bought with a price. He mentioned it last week. You don't even own you. And you should be really thankful for that. Because we're not really good at leading ourselves. We need something outside of us to lead us. And Jesus actually proved our worth by dying on the cross. So this is why, before Jesus left, he said, I don't ever want you to forget my sacrifice for you. It always comes back to Jesus. Always comes back to the cross. I don't want you to forget, because in your humanness, you have a tendency to forget what is most important. So we're going to remember. So if you're here this morning and you've never participated with us in the Lord's Supper or communion, let me just explain what it is. It is for Christians. It is for those who have placed their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And it is in obedience to what Jesus commanded us to do. And that is to remember his death, burial, and his resurrection for us. So as the men and women come forward in a second to serve us, there's going to be 2 cups, one stacked on the other. Grab them both, hold on to it, and wait until we're all served, and then I'll come back up and lead us. Father, I know and understand that this text is challenging for many of us. But God, unless we take to heart the good words, your good words, we have no hope of living the lives that not only we want, but that you intended for us to have. So, Father, I pray for every heart in the room, including my own, that you'd continue to press in by the power of your Spirit. It's not about our identity and anything external, but it's about what Jesus has done for us. So as we enter into this time, we ask that you would speak to our hearts, that you would illuminate our minds. And if there's anything that needs to be revealed and confessed, Father, I pray that we would have the courage to do that. Thank you for the grace, the mercy, the forgiveness. No matter what we have been through, no matter what wrongs we have suffered or inflicted on others, there is forgiveness because of the cross, and we are grateful for that. We pray this in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.